This criminal story is full of mysterious links tying the European migrant crisis to the war in Donbas, French farmers to Ukrainian volunteer battalions, and including cows and kalashnikovs. The Ukrainian security service tried to play the role of Europe's savior from far-right terrorism. But in the West, there was evidence that the nearly forgotten conflict in Ukraine's east had created a new weapons market for extremists and criminal groups. Non-Le-Petit is a small village in northeastern France. The local population, all 80 people, live according to the rhythms of provincial European life, surrounded by historical ruins, dairy farms, clover fields, and other pastoral charms. This was the home of Gregoire Moutaux, a livestock specialist who hardly stood out from his quiet neighbors until one day in May 2016 when he was arrested at the Ukrainian-Polish border for carrying a loaded machine gun. In the trunk there was an entire weapons arsenal, 5 automatic kalashnikovs, 2 grenade launchers, 125 kilograms of TNT, and 100 electric detonators. The Frenchman had allegedly gathered all of these weapons to use to commit terrorist attacks in his home country.
His intention was to attack Muslim mosques, Jewish synagogues, an institution that collect taxes. I want to say that this is a first in the history of the Ukrainian security service. This is the first time we managed to reveal a terrorist network that was working on the territory of a European country. And we managed to prevent serious terrorist acts.
Just 2 weeks after the arrest, the head of the Ukrainian security service presented Gregoire Moutaux to the public as a right-wing extremist who was dissatisfied with France's migration policies, the growing number of refugees from the Middle East, as well as the country's bureaucracy and high tax rates. According to Hromadske, the detainee was also a highly trained terrorist.
Look at the way he holds the Kalashnikov. Only special forces hold an automatic weapon that way.
At this time, the Frenchman had already been transferred to Kiev and was being kept in solitary confinement by the SBU. It was there that he had his first meeting with a lawyer.
He looks like an average young man, quite a positive one even. He doesn't fit the description of the suspicions under which he was arrested.
The Ukrainian security service made a strong argument. Moutaux allegedly shared his plan to organize a terrorist attack with their agents. This was revealed in secret surveillance recordings that were discovered shortly after the Frenchman was detained.
This explosive, you can big boom in Paris. Yeah, but no, don't worry about this. This is 15 target, and the other one it's I don't know, in English it's center taxis, I don't know. It's could do this in the night, no in the days. So it's nobody in the office, so they don't care about this.
And yet, according to the lawyers, the SBU investigation had a lot of gaps and procedural violations.
Accusations are being made that Moutaux intended to, or was preparing to commit crimes with a group of individuals. But from the beginning of the case, and in court, we never found out who else could be in that group.
He says that his group has about 10 people. The accomplices have not been established, but this isn't required by law. According to the Ukrainian security service, it's the French law enforcement who should be looking for the rest of the terrorist organization that Moutaux was allegedly involved in.
It could have been possible to substantiate these suspicions and accusations, but not at such a volume and with such severity.
Regarding the evidence, I agree with you that there isn't enough, but we felt that it was enough to at least make him a suspect. Now, the court has to decide whether or not there's enough evidence to convict him of organizing a terrorist act. One year after the SBU finished their investigation, Hromadske traveled to France to find out what people in his home country think of Gregoire Moutaux's case. This is where Gregoire Moutaux lived before his arrest in Ukraine. Even now, the residents of Non-Le-Petit are skeptical of the charges made by the SBU.
He was a good guy. He helped his neighbors and didn't create problems. He was a livestock specialist. We knew his family. No one here thought he was a terrorist. There were no indications. We have nothing bad to say about him.
French law enforcement, on the other hand, seems to have forgotten about Gregoire Moutaux' case already. In the end, Hromadske managed to obtain a written response from the district attorney of Nancy, François Perrin. It reads,
It should be noted that from the outset, the anti-terrorist department in Paris believed that the information provided by the Ukrainian authorities was insufficient and does not justify pursuing this case.
Nevertheless, the local police searched several addresses where Moutaux lived, but didn't find any evidence of preparation for a crime. The sole piece of circumstantial evidence against Gregoire Moutaux was found at his home in Non-le-Petit. Perhaps the only possible piece of evidence linking him to French right-wing radicals is a T-shirt bearing the logo of the Renouveau Français movement. Renouveau Français, or French Renewal, is a far-right ultranationalist political party. Its members oppose the influx of immigrants, modern liberal values, and are generally opposed to France's republican system of government.
The investigation into Gregoire Moutaux's connections to the far right demonstrates that he was a supporter of Renouveau Français, but was not a member of this group. The investigation also revealed that he maintained connections with one or more members of this group. The investigation did not link this group to events in Ukraine.
In the last 10 years, far-right groups in Europe have been under close scrutiny by anti-terrorist organizations. This is especially the case since 2011, when right-wing terrorist Anders Breivik carried out attacks targeting migrants and liberals, killing 77 people and wounding 151 others.
This is something we have to monitor very, very seriously. At this stage, let's be honest, the jihadist terrorism is the main threat in Europe.
There isn't a group in France, large or small, that proclaims terrorism as a method of political struggle. But there are groups of radical nationalists that use street violence against, for example, migrants, and in general align with Russian causes. But this isn't terrorism.
So who were Moutaux's mysterious accomplices that the Ukrainian security services were seeking to look for in France? On a cattle farm in a small village, much like the one where Gregoire Moutaux worked, Hromadske met with yet another Frenchman who figured in the SBU investigation. According to the Ukrainian security services, Eric Garçonnet delivered some of the money from France to Ukraine. Garçonnet didn't want to speak on camera, but he claims that he went to Ukraine to look for a wife and never traveled with Moutaux. What's more, he claims they were never close friends. In June 2016, the police detained and interrogated Garçonnet, at which time he confirmed that he did, at Moutaux's request, transmit an envelope of money to a third party, but denied any involvement in the arms trade or terrorism.
A search of Eric Garçonnet's house didn't yield any results. Checking his mobile phones and computer didn't reveal anything useful for establishing the truth. Moreover, the investigators have established that Eric Garçonnet doesn't have any connections to the far right.
Based on Garçonnet's recommendation, Gregoire Moutaux spent 3 weeks working on a farm owned by Michel T. and Philip L. in Ukraine. According to them, he expressed far-right views several times and eventually revealed that he was going to gather weapons for some kind of impressive action. But this is all the French authorities were able to establish in Moutaux's case. They did not find evidence of preparing for a terrorist attack or tenuous links to terrorist groups. In the end, their suspicions were reduced to possible weapons smuggling. As it turned out, local far-rightists are much more likely to be involved in the latter and not the former.
There are examples of weapon smugglers that are politicized. As a rule, they have links to right-wing nationalists. They are members of some criminal groups, and this is how they make money. They do not do this for political reasons. First of all, they are criminal groups, but in some cases, they are also linked by their radical, far-right political perspective. They look for contrast in Eastern Europe, in former Yugoslavia, in the former Soviet Union, in order to buy and import weapons. These contacts are generally informal, but in general they are with arms sellers that are also linked to local far-right nationalists.
In 2014, informal international links brought several French people as well as other European radicals to the war in Donbas. Some of them came to fight for pro-Russian separatists, while others joined Ukrainian volunteer battalions such as the Azov battalion, whose members are well known in Ukraine for their far-right views. The exact connections that brought Gregoire Moutaux to Ukraine in search of weapons remains unknown, but according to the indictment, he came to the Azov regiment specifically.
Sometime during the second half of June 2015, Gregoire Moutaux appealed to the servicemen from the Azov Regiment of Ukraine's National Guard in the city of Mariupol, in the Donetsk region. In particular, he spoke with Ukrainian citizen Mikhail Zubov, offering him money in exchange for the purchase of weapons and ammunition in Ukraine, without legal permission, to which he received a reply on possible assistance in the matter.
It is my deep conviction that Moutaux knew who he was approaching. He didn't go just to any serviceman with his proposition. He knew that Zubov, because of his functional duties, is responsible for weapons and ammunition in the Azov regiment. Over the next few months, Moutaux and Zubov wrote to each other using encrypted messenger services. At the beginning of November, they met again in Kharkiv. There, they agreed on a list of weapons and a price, 16,000 euros. According to the official investigation, Zubov received a partial deposit from Moutaux and Garçonnet that winter. But by March 2016, just 9 months after his first meeting with the Frenchman, Zubov had resigned from the Azov battalion and joined the SBU. There's a significant time gap, and it's difficult for me to understand what it's linked to. We asked Zubov about this. At first, he didn't trust Moutaux's intentions at all. It was more likely the money that interested him, more so than the foreigner's intentions. Zubov is the same SBU agent with whom Moutaux, on the recording, allegedly shared his plans for future terrorist acts. They met several times in Kharkiv, where, returning from the war, the Azov soldier lived with his wife and daughter. Zubov took the Frenchman to a training ground, taught him how to shoot a submachine gun and grenade launcher, and planned to accompany him to the border with Poland, promising to help him with the local border guards, all under the direction of the Ukrainian Security Service. Zubov worked to identify the criminal intentions of French citizen Gregoire Moutaux. However, he didn't give the Frenchman real weapons. Instead, before leaving Kharkiv, he loaded Moutaux's car with imitation weapons, machine guns without munitions, with fake explosives and cartridges. But is it possible that prior to his resignation, when he was in charge of the weapons arsenal for one of the Azov units, that Zubov could have sold Moutaux real weapons? And if so, why did he change his mind? And where then was he going to get all those grenade launchers and TNT?
Definitely not in the Azov regiment. From the very beginning, we kept records of weapons, and not just ammunition, but also munitions and food.
Unfortunately, Zubov can't answer these questions himself. He died in Kharkiv last spring under mysterious circumstances. Last night, the man living here strangled his wife and 4-year-old daughter before taking his own life. But Zubov's story isn't the only case of an Azov soldier getting involved in the arms trade. There is at least one other criminal case in which a former Azov soldier, known as Hromadske, is mentioned. In February 2017, the Ukrainian Security Service allegedly managed to buy 10 grenades from him during a procurement operation. A few days later, he fled abroad and is now on a wanted list. On top of that, in the Unified State Register of Judicial Rulings, Hromadske managed to find more than a dozen sentences against soldiers from the Azov regiment for trying to take arms out of the ATO zone, ranging from a single grenade taken as a souvenir to several thousand cartridges.
2,000 cartridges? Well, he probably wanted to shoot. At the very least, they probably aren't from the official supply of weapons and ammunition that we receive from the state. The leaders of the regiment have never protected criminals. If we were doing that, then there wouldn't be those dozen detainees.
Of course, the Azov regiment is far from the only possible source of illegal weapons flowing into the country from the armed conflict in Donbas. Nearly every month, Ukrainian law enforcement uncover caches of weapons and ammunition, which it would seem should be left in the war zone.
We opened the weapons arsenal. Just like us, our enemies can take these weapons into peaceful regions. In October alone, we registered more than 2,000 cases of weapons seizures. And since the beginning of the year, we have seen more than 8,000 such cases.
We have a term called patriotism, and when people return from the war zone with ammunition and weapons, passing through checkpoints where their brother-in-arms stand, the ones they fought with whom they looked death in the face, no one will check them. Weapons in Ukraine are almost always sold for a pittance. For example, closer to the east, a machine gun can be bought for $1,000 or in some cases $500, let alone grenades, cartridges, and things like that.
Unfortunately, these problems arise in any country at war.
most of the weapons that you can find in Europe, they come from the Western Balkans. So we've started working hard on that, doing more among the different police in Europe, tasking Europol, which is our agency for police cooperation, to really work on the subject. So if it's relevant for Ukraine, we'll do that again. It's no surprise. More arms in Ukraine because of the conflict you have in the Donbas and so on. So that would not be a surprise.
There was no coordination because there was no systematic movement of weapons. In response to Hromadske's requests, the SBU, as they are the ones investigating cases of arms smuggling in Ukraine, stated that in recent years only a few isolated instances of arms trafficking to the West have been investigated. In general, there are more cases of illegal weapons being brought into the country, not taken out of it, the Ukrainian Security Service said. The majority of Ukrainian law enforcement officers that spoke with Hromadske admitted that Gregoire Moutaux' story is the largest attempt at smuggling Ukrainian weapons into the West that they know of since the beginning of the war. Fortunately, this attempt failed, but it is most likely not the first and not the last. Given the large numbers of objects and goods moving across the border, I think it wouldn't be hard to hide something among these items. How can we identify them? By searching every vehicle? Can you imagine how long the lines would be? The cooperation between Ukrainian and French law enforcement proved to be practically fruitless in this case. In fact, they were essentially investigating different crimes. The SBU was claiming to counter terrorism, while the French were focused on organized international arms trafficking. As a result, the investigation failed to answer key questions, such as who exactly sent the French farmer to the Ukrainian volunteer battalion, why the long-planned transaction fell through, and who was awaiting Moutaux's return home with the weapons. It would be very interesting to hear this from Moutaux himself, but unfortunately, he has yet to offer any evidence. On May 21st, the Lyubomil District Court found Gregoire Moutaux, a French national, guilty of preparing terror attacks, illegal acquisition of weapons, and attempting to smuggle them into the EU. The court found no evidence of the existence of the deeply conspiratorial terrorist organization, so they requalified Moutaux's crimes from grouped to individual. As a result, Moutaux was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment, of which, according to the Savchenko law, the Frenchman would have only to serve 3. Moutaux's new lawyer, Oleg Lyagutko, is planning to appeal the decision, seeking to get the charges of terrorism dropped altogether. Gregoire Moutaux himself remains silent.